Dear deep sea fishers of Reddit, what's the strangest thing you've seen heard on the open ocean? I was fishing off the coast of Malaysia in the middle of the night. Suddenly, the night sky brightened and I saw a bright glowing orb appear to the bow. The orb moved slowly across the sky, leaving a bright yellow trail and seemed to have sparks coming off it for about 20 seconds before disappearing into the night. After getting back to shore, I learned that it was a retired Japanese satellite ray entering the atmosphere. Same thing happened to me off the coast of Australia. We were fishing in the dark, and then gradually the night sky brightened, and I saw a bright glowing orb appear to the bow. The orb moved slowly across the sky, and gave off a tremendous amount of heat. After getting back to shore, we realized it was now Sunday. I do a lot of night fishing off of SC and FL. I get a lot of fish that are bitten in half by sharks. Some of them had to have been very, very large. When you reel in a large sport fish's head like some kind of sequel to The Old Man and the Sea and realize the shark is close to half the size of your boat miles and miles offshore, essentially in the middle of nowhere, you get more than a little freaked out. I'm a diver. We were doing a night dive on the Great Barrier Reef when we came up to a cave-like structure, really just a rock formation, which is known for turtles. We shine our flashlights inside and see these huge freaking flippers. In there was a 100-year-old turtle about the size of a small car in diameter. This isn't anything like the supernatural stories that you were probably after, but I found it very strange. I've fallen asleep on a beach before and woken up to a massive sea turtle maybe 10 feet from me. I assume it was digging a nest to lay eggs, but it was too dark and I was too drunk to know for sure. What I can tell you is that if you aren't expecting to see an animal that size up close, then it can be pretty frightening alarming. I was sitting in a little boat off Gran Canaria once, when I heard a strange whirring noise, like when kids stick playing cards through the spokes on their bike. I heard it a few times and wondered what it was, and then it hit me. It was a flying fish. It literally hit me, and then floundered around the boat for a few seconds before I picked it up and hurled it back. Those things are goddamned weird. Its wings were gross. I remember I was on vacation in the Caribbean, heading for Curacao I think, when we were allowed to go to the very tip of the bow. Whenever I peeked over the railing I saw flying fish jumping up in front of us, often going faster than our ship. It amazed me, because not only were we going pretty fast, they were in the air for so long as well. I had a friend who was stranded in a rowboat for a couple of days. He got pretty dehydrated, and later told us of these wild hallucinations of beautiful female water spirits encouraging him to join them in the water. It was strange because he was one of those no-nonsense guys who didn't believe in the supernatural, but he said these things were so real to him. Sirens. But no joke, dehydration and sun exposure will frick you up. Glad he's okay. My dad and I were fishing off the Florida Keys. We had our anchor out and been fishing for about an hour. 15 minutes later the boat gets bumped and we rock a little bit. My dad jokes saying looks like Jaws is after us, better stay away from the edges. 10 seconds after him saying that the boat begins moving backwards. We are being towed by our anchor line that's in the water. Whatever has it is now dragging the boat backwards, slowly getting faster, and our boat get pulled under too. Next thing I hear is no freaking way as my dad drops his pole, runs from the front to the back, grabs a knife and cuts the anchor line. After that we decided that fishing was not in the cards that day. I can't believe I am even writing this. I had the exact same thing happen to me and my ex-father-in-law in Moreton Bay, QLD, Australia. I had a friend who would go deep sea fishing and stay out at sea for days at a time. He told me that at times he would hear some of the most bizarre, unearthly noises ever out there at night, and assured me that there must be things out there we have no idea of, considering we apparently know more about what's on the moon than we know about what's in our own oceans. I'm inclined to agree with him. Things on the moon, 0. Things in the ocean, hella. Out off Bermuda back in the 80s or early 90s we saw a huge piece of rocket fuselage or aeroplane floating vertically 5-6 feet out of the water. It was out in the Gulf Stream and was moving quite quickly. This was before internet, so we never knew what it was part of. I used to live in Bermuda when I was a kid circa mid to late 80s. There is an absolutely obscene amount of wrecks around the island as well, I am sure you're fully aware. Not a deep sea fisherman, but I was in the Navy. We were a few hours off the coast of Thailand. I was in the hangar bay of the carrier for morning muster and there were trees floating in the ocean, like they had been cut down and thrown in, bobbing right side up with their bare branches sticking out of the water. It was really weird to me. A friend's cousin is a tuna fisherman. They found a deer swimming over 100 miles off the coast of New Zealand a few years ago. Don't mind me, just evolving here. I'm not a fisherman but a sailor who was racing in a yacht race off the California coast May years ago. We had finished the race in Santa Barbara, and a few of us had volunteered to sail the boat back up to San Francisco where we had started. We were off of Point Conception one night at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. Me and a buddy of mine were on watch and talking to stay awake. He was steering and I was leaning against the doghouse looking out at him. We talking about something or other when all of a sudden it became daylight. Bright daylight. All I remember were the sources of his eyes looking back at me to say, WTF. I imagined I looked the same to him because I was absolutely shocked. Then in about 2 seconds, the light faded to the horizon on our right, and we witnessed a rocket taking off from Vandenberg Air Force Base. We watched it ascend into the night sky, and once we saw that it had jettisoned its first stage, we started to joke nervously about the odds of it landing on us. It didn't, and me and my buddy will always remember those 3-4 minutes as one of the most singular experiences we've ever had. We had fun telling the rest of the crew about it the next day. They were peeved that they missed it. I was on a dive boat off the coast of the Big Island in Hawaii last week. It was after dark and a pod of dolphins were spending a lot of time playing around off our stern. They were pretty interested in us it seemed since every once in a while you could see a head pop up and just sort of look at us for a few seconds. Pretty much everyone was hanging out on the dive platform on the stern when suddenly this huge manta ray comes right up to the surface about 5 feet away from the boat. It was easily 10 feet wide. It did a quick flip and was gone in a few seconds. It wasn't too freaky as we'd been night diving with them a few nights before that, but I could see how someone who wasn't aware of them would get really freaked out. The ocean has a lot of weird stuff in it. Not fishing, but Navy well off the coast of Malaysia. Found a corpse which was incredibly bloated and when rolled over had no face. We named him Bob. He was just bobbing along and you disturbed him. Went calabash fishing last year off Maitali Beach about 8 miles out in open water. We were just sitting there trolling at a slow rate when we heard this humming noise. It rattled the boat a good bit. IDK if it was under it or nearby or what it was really, but it wasn't loud. It went on for maybe 20-30 seconds then it was gone. Everyone heard it and said something about it. Couldn't have been the boat. The boat didn't sound like that. Pretty weird. We would occasionally hear Navy nuke subs going in and out of Coronado and this is exactly what they sound. It's pretty subsonic, like. Once we hit 3 kelp balls in a row and caught more fish than I thought possible. I am envious of the stories I hear about times where the boat was too full, but one time it happened. I saw a man crapping in a 5-gallon bucket on a 35-foot contender 100 miles offshore. He waved. I have been out in the open ocean, no land or other boats around, and the sea was perfectly calm on a clear day. Our boat was only small and it was not moving at all. It was perfectly still. There was no wind. The water surface looked like glass. It was eerie and slightly disturbing. Only comfort was I was not alone and we were not a sailboat. While on a sailing cruise returning to Miami from the Bahamas, I was permitted to pilot the boat while the crew sat down for dinner. I was told to simply follow a certain heading on the compass. As we were going along I noticed the position of the sun was rather rapidly changing as I was chasing the heading on the compass. I returned to what I thought was the correct heading and watched in amazement as the compass began to spin in circles. We had been scuba diving so several of us had compasses and they were all exhibiting the same behavior. The heading on the GPS was unaffected. After maybe 10-20 seconds the spin slowed to a stop back on the correct heading. The crew logged the coordinates of the anomaly. The best guess we had was that we'd crossed over an old shipwreck. Perhaps something hauling a large amount of some magnetic metal over to the Bahamas. Was fishing at night off the coast of Norway in the 70s I believe when a call came on radio. Worth nothing, it was an open secret all the radio operators on the trawlers worked for the government and also had sonar equipment to listen for USSR subs. To evacuate a 100 or so mile area, and if the trawlers could not get their nets up in time to GTFO then they should just cut them free. which is a very expensive thing to do when you have dozens of miles of nets out in the water. On the way out, my granddad's trawler and other trawlers in the area saw a massive white flash on the horizon. After returning to Hull, it was discovered a ship called the Gaul had never returned and had lost all radio contact around time of this flash. Fast forward 20 or so years later and the wreckage of the Gaul was discovered and officially sank because of a waste flow pipe being overwhelmed by a massive wave that flooded the lower compartments of the ship and sent her to the bottom. Rather interestingly, there was no human remains found on or near the ship, nor any equipment, food, bedding, etc, and all the windows had been blown outwards along with a hole about 3 meters across through the middle of the ship, with all the metalwork being twisted upwards towards the sky. My granddad always insisted up to his death that the sea that night was as still as a pond and that his radio operator was fairly sure the GTFO warning came from the Gaul. As well, around the time of the Gaul's sinking, 16 unknown graves were created and filled in Murmansk, Russia. Another one of his favorite stories was that one day the engine for hauling in the nets was redlining and came very close to exploding, so had to be shut off as they assumed the nets had got stuck on the bottom. A few minutes later, a Soviet sub surfaced behind them with the nets stuck to the periscope, complete with a bunch of very off Soviet sailors armed with guns who unhooked the nets and disappeared back under the water. It was a known tactic that Soviet subs tried to sit under the trawlers and use them as cover to get out into the Atlantic, hence a lot of the ships having government paid radio operators on board. How do we know these stories are true? I mean, these are fishermen telling them. Yeah, you could say there was something a little fishy about some of these stories. A couple that are friends with my parents sailed from France to Africa, then to South America. They also didn't have all the proper equipment you are supposed to have in order to do this legally and as safe as possible. They were a week or two away from the end of their trip when they confirmed their feeling of not being alone. At night they'd think they'd hear another ship but no sight of anything. They'd hear water breaking from something but never saw why. This continued and seemed to be getting closer. Then just a few days before the end of their trip, an American submarine suddenly surfaced near them. It stayed afloat for a while then went back under. His theory was since they didn't have a proper sat radio, they weren't aware they were being hailed to identify. The American Navy was probably like, WTF is this, and kept track of them or even followed them for days, weeks. At the end, the Americans were probably even more curious. Surfaced, saw a bewildered sunburned French sailing couple, cursed and went back to doing whatever they were supposed to be doing. Not a fisher, but spent some time at sea. Used to work on an oceanographic research vessel. Doing box cores and piston cores of the ocean floor brought up all kinds of things. Coke cans, a magic marker, etc. If you're on an old steamer trade route, you bring up a lot of clinker coal, which is the burnt up coal from the old boilers that they put over the side. It's possible to analyze the clinker coal and determine what general area it was mined in England or Europe, the USA, etc. One fun thing we used to do was lash a small net bag to the cable that held the box core, and we'd put styrofoam cups in it. As the box core and its cable would descend, sometimes several thousand fathoms, the cups would compress due to the pressure. We'd haul up the box core and in the bag would be perfect little styrofoam cups, one stroke too high. We had hundreds of them. Also once saw a whale swimming by, mid-Atlantic, that was trailing a load of fishing gear, nets and some high flares. It was not pleasant to see. One was an abandoned boat floating past us in the night. Not deep sea but fishing. About 10 years ago now, I was fishing at Coles Bay, Australia. There were 4 of us in the 14-foot aluminium boat that day. We were bottom fishing for flathead in the bay when the weather started cutting up. Not wanting to give up so early, we decided to do one more drift in near the beach. We were in shallow enough water that you could almost see the bottom. Quiet fishing occurs for a few minutes when suddenly my rod almost bends completely in two and the line snaps. The same thing happens to my uncle to the right of me. Thinking we're hitting rocks and snagging, my granddad tells my cousin to pull his line up. Something bites. He manages to pull it up for 1 or 2 winds before his line snaps, just enough to pull this thing's shadow into view. It was the shadow of a massive stingray, almost as long as the boat and wide enough to darken the waters around us. We all went completely silent and watched it swim away. Never seen anything like it before or since. We checked later and the water was only 15-20 feet deep there. From some of these responses, I'm starting to wonder if people in submarines just enjoy fricking with people on boats. This is a big ol' floofer. Like this video to pet the floofer. Thanks for watching. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video, or don't. Either way, have a great day you magnificent people.